November 1940. A German bomber is sliding through the night sky over central England. Up in the cockpit, the pilot can barely see the ground, but he doesn't need to. His crew has maps. They have timing. They have a target they've been drilled on. Birmingham, one of Britain's biggest industrial hubs. Then the city appears, not as a tidy skyline, not as street lamps and signs. It shows up the way cities show up at night during a bombing war. As fire. Bright, hungry flames crawling across what looks like factory districts. A hot glow where rail yards should be. A smear of burning orange that screams, "You're over the right place." The crew feels that little rush of certainty. The Pathfinders were here first. Markers are down. The target is lit up. The shape below matches what their brains expect Birmingham to look like from altitude. At speed, under stress, bombs go out. Big ones. The kind meant to rip apart heavy industry and choke a city's production lines. And the bomber turns away into the darkness. Mission done. Headed home. Convinced they just helped grind Britain's war machine into dust. Except they didn't. Because the Birmingham that burned under them wasn't Birmingham at all. It was a field. A carefully chosen patch of countryside with fire laid out like a stage set. Flames arranged to imitate rail sidings and factory blocks. Trenches made to look like canals. Patterns built to give bomber crews the same visual story they wanted to see. A major industrial city getting hammered. The real Birmingham, dark, quiet, and still working, sat miles away. This isn't a story about German pilots being clueless. In 1940, the Luftwaffe was a serious night bombing force. These crews trained hard. Their early war navigation and attack methods were among the most advanced in the world. And they were dangerous. But Britain figured out a brutal truth about night bombing. It's not only about finding a target, it's about believing you found it. And Britain learned how to feed that belief. Before we get deeper, quick thing. If you're into the lesser-known tricks and tactics of World War II, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next parts of this story. What the British pulled off wasn't one clever stunt. It was a system, a national-scale deception program designed to do something that sounds ridiculous until you see the logic. They built fake cities to pull bombs away from real ones. The British name you'll most often hear for these locations is Starfish sites, decoy targets meant to burn, sparkle, and smoke at the right moment so German crews would unload on empty ground. Over time, the network expanded into a whole family of decoys, not just one type. By early 1941, British planners weren't thinking in terms of a few dummy fires. They were thinking like stage designers with an Air Force's budget. Maps covered in circles, sites spread across the country, a coordinated web of lies. Picture a senior Air Ministry officer standing over a map of Britain where decoy sites are marked like infection spots, red rings scattered near the places German bombers wanted most. Factories, ports, rail hubs, and cities that kept the war running. Hundreds of sites, thousands of people involved. All for one goal, make the enemy waste his bombs. To understand how this worked, you need to see the decoy program the way Britain built it, layered like levels in a game, each level more convincing than the last. Level 1, the light tricks. The simplest decoys were basically fake towns made of light. These weren't random bulbs tossed in a field. The lights were arranged to mimic patterns you'd expect from altitude. Lines that felt like roads, clusters that suggested neighborhoods, brighter concentrations where a factory district would be. Some setups used timed sequences so the lighting looked alive, like traffic moving or industrial sites switching patterns. They were placed near real targets on purpose. The idea wasn't to create a fantasy world in the middle of nowhere. The idea was to create a believable alternative when a bomber crew was approaching the general area and needed that last bit of confirmation. At 12,000 to 15,000 feet on a dark night, with a crew strained and tired, those light patterns could look like a real urban layout. Good enough for a crew that just wanted to finish the run and get out. But there was a problem. Light can be controlled, it can be dimmed, it can be cut. And once both sides learned how blackout rules worked, lights alone stopped being a sure bet. Also, the Germans adapted. They leaned harder into what you can't easily hide. Fire. Level 2. Fire that looked like success. The next level of decoys were built around controlled burns, fires designed to look like the aftermath of a successful strike. This is where the deception gets nasty, because it's aimed right at the bomber crew's mind. If you're flying toward a target at night and you see markers from pathfinders, then you see fires already burning, your brain snaps into a simple story. The first wave hit, the target is confirmed, we're over it. Britain set up decoy fire sites positioned so they could be seen in the same general visual space as the real target, close enough to be plausible, far enough to pull bombers away once the attack began. When bombs started falling on the real city, decoy crews watched the sky. They watched marker patterns, spacing, brightness, the way fires flared. Then they created their own matching blaze on the decoy ground. That meant coal braziers and fuel loads arranged in shapes that looked intentional from above, trenches filled with oil or other burnable material to create long, bright lines of flame. Even smoke behavior mattered because smoke is part of what reconnaissance photos later used to judge damage. These teams weren't doing this from a safe distance. They often worked while bombs were falling in the region. Their job was to keep the illusion running even under pressure, even when the decoy itself started taking hits. And the psychological payoff was huge. German crews didn't want uncertainty. They wanted confirmation. Britain gave it to them. But Britain didn't stop at lights and fake burning. They pushed it into something even more ambitious. Level 3. Entire fake towns. The top tier was the full night decoy town, a more complete fake version of a city target, not a detailed replica you'd walk through in daylight. That would have been wasteful. The point wasn't to fool a person standing on the ground. The point was to fool a bomber crew looking down through darkness, haze, smoke, and fear. So the decoy towns were built for one viewpoint, the sky. This is where you see things like dummy rail yards laid out so they rid correctly from altitude. Simple structures, wood, canvas, scaffolding, arranged to create the right shapes. Fake industrial buildings painted or framed to match the profile of real facilities from a distance. Features that looked like docks or harbor edges, designed to burn convincingly when hit. Even the idea of air defense mattered. Decoys could include false defensive activity, visual cues that suggested a real target under attack, because a real target would draw fire. The goal wasn't to win a gunfight, or it was to complete the illusion. This place is defended, therefore it matters, therefore we're on target. The key insight behind all three levels was the same. German crews weren't just hunting a location, they were hunting reassurance. They wanted to believe their navigation was right. They wanted to believe their target was real. They wanted to believe the bombs they risked their lives delivering were doing something. The decoys were engineered to provide exactly that feeling, just enough evidence to lock the crew into a decision. And once a crew commits in the final minutes of a run, it's hard to pull them back. In combat, second-guessing can get you killed, so crews tend to move forward, not backward. That's how precision can be turned into wasted effort. By mid-1941, the British decoy network had scaled up. Hundreds of sites, thousands of personnel, real money and materials invested, and a level of coordination that's easy to underestimate because the tools sound simple. But that raises the big question. Did it actually work? It's one thing to build a clever trap. It's another thing to make a modern air force fall into it night after night. To answer that, you have to zoom in on how the deception was run at ground level, minute by minute, by crews who were basically staging a deadly performance in real time. One night in 1941 near Coventry, a decoy site crew is waiting. They're not sitting in a city shelter hoping bombs miss them. They're in position with one job: make bombs come to them instead. The control team is in a protected spot, sandbags, a bunker-like setup, watching for the signal. Above ground, the set is ready. Dozens upon dozens of fire points placed in a planned layout that matches what bomber crews would expect a city center to look like when it starts burning. Fuel matters, placement matters, timing matters. Then the call comes in. Enemy aircraft in the area, markers going down on the real Coventry. Now the decoy team has to make a decision that sounds small but is everything. When to light. Too early, and German crews might still be oriented on the real city. Too late, and the first waves may have already committed and released. So the sequence begins. Staggered, deliberate. The markers first. A handful of bright points in a pattern that visually resembles what a Pathfinder drop might look like from a distance. Then, after a short delay, more fires, scattered like early impacts. Then, a little later, A wider spread, suggesting a raid is expanding, that the damage is growing. This is not random burning, it's controlled storytelling. Britain had learned something uncomfortable by watching its own cities suffer. Different places burn in different ways. Neighborhoods don't burn like factories. Oil and chemicals behave differently than wood and brick. Heat, smoke color, and brightness create signatures that trained observers on both sides come to recognize. So, decoy planners studied burn patterns. They compared what the enemy expected to see with what could be created in open ground. They built fuel loads to create long-lasting glow, bright flare-ups, and thick smoke that would look right from altitude and also look right in post-raid assessment. They weren't trying to create perfection. Perfection would be suspicious. They were trying to create plausibility, something that under pressure becomes reality, because that's the trick. At 180 miles an hour in darkness, with flak bursts around you and a tight fuel margin, the human brain doesn't want a debate. It wants a decision. And the decoy sight is designed to make that decision easy. In Part 2, we'll get into how Britain added extra layers, sound and impact cues, heat signals as detection methods evolved, and the placement math that made a decoy appear exactly where a navigator expected a city to be. More importantly, we'll look at the people operating these sites, because for the deception to work, someone had to be on the ground, lighting the trap while bombs came down. By now, you can see the basic trick. Give a bomber crew something that looks like the target at the exact moment they need to commit. But the British didn't rely on one illusion. They stacked illusions on top of each other, because once the Luftwaffe started adapting, Britain adapted right back. And that's when the decoys stopped being lights and flames and became a full-on sensory trap, making fire behave like a bombed city. A real city hit by incendiaries doesn't burn in one neat burst. It develops. It spreads. It throws off different kinds of glow. British planners learned that the pattern mattered just as much as the brightness. So decoy operators didn't light every fire at once. They ran a script. First came a tight cluster, something that read like the kind of marking a lead aircraft might leave behind. Then, after a short pause, is scattered fires that suggested early hits. Then, after another pause, a wider bloom that looked like the attack was rolling forward, section by section. From high altitude through smoke and adrenaline, this gradual build felt like the real thing, a city being chewed up in stages. Fuel was engineered too. You need a long-lasting base glow. You need flare-ups that leap high enough to be seen. You need smoke that reads as serious damage in photographs. So decoy sites mixed fuels to get different effects: sustained heat, fast, bright flames, and thick, dark smoke that could stain the night sky and later prove destruction in reconnaissance images. That's the part people miss. The decoy wasn't only for the bomber crew in the moment. It was also built to look believable afterward when someone looked at photos and tried to judge. Did we hit the target? Now, fire can be convincing. But the British recognized another problem. From the air, bombing isn't just visual. Crews also sense the attack. They feel it. They hear it. And the decoys started simulating that too. The impact illusion. A bomber crew can't hear a city the way someone on the ground can. Engines drown most surface sound, but explosions carry. Big impacts have a distinct punch, even at altitude. And crews often describe the experience of attacking a hot target as a mix of sight and sensation, flashes, shock, secondary bursts. So British decoy sites added controlled detonations. Small charges could be buried and triggered at timed intervals, creating a pattern of impacts that felt like bombs walking across an urban area. Not massive blasts, not something that would flatten a block. Just enough to produce that unmistakable cue. Hits are landing. Some sites went further with simulated airbursts, pyrotechnic effects that created flashes above ground level, the kind of thing that, from a distance, could be misread as defensive fire or explosions blooming upward. Again, it wasn't about fooling someone with binoculars at noon. It was about feeding a bomber crew a set of signals that matched their expectations at night, under stress. Because in the air, expectation is powerful. And Britain's entire program was designed around one ugly truth. Once a crew believes they're over the target, they interpret everything they see through that belief. Heat and the next round of adaptation. By 1942, the Luftwaffe began experimenting with ways to locate targets that didn't rely only on eyesight. Early heat detection methods were crude compared to what people imagine today, but the direction was obvious. Find the warm industrial signatures even when visibility was bad. Britain got wind of it through intelligence. And then Britain did what it always did with this program. They built a workaround. Some decoy sites created hotspots, areas of sustained heat that could resemble active industry, buried fires that could smolder for long periods, controlled heat sources that would register as something more than a quick blaze. In certain locations, decoys even mimicked industrial steam output. You don't need a functioning power plant to generate steam. You need a boiler and a schedule. Steam plumes and steady heat were part of what made heavy industry look alive. So decoys began adding those cues, because a convincing lie isn't static. It evolves to match how the enemy is learning to see. The most important part, where the decoys were placed. All of this would fail if the decoys were in the wrong spot, and placement was the true genius of the system. German bombers in 1940 to 41 used navigation methods that depended on predictability, timing, dead reckoning, radio aids, and visible features like coastlines, rivers, and rail lines when the moon and weather allowed it. British analysts studied those habits and essentially asked one key question. If a German crew approaches a target using their typical route, where will they expect the city to appear beneath them at the critical moment? That answer dictated where a decoy was built. So if a common approach toward Birmingham involved tracking a certain rail corridor or landmark chain, the decoy would be planted along that expected path, often several miles from the real city, but close enough to be believable from the air. The decoy didn't have to be perfect. It had to appear at the exact moment the crew's mental clock said, "This should be it." When timing, location, and visual cues aligned, the crew's brain did the rest. The psychological trap behind the engineering. This is where the story moves from clever construction to outright psychological warfare. British intelligence analysts looked at captured material, raid patterns, and how crews reported their missions, and the conclusion was blunt. Crews under pressure tend to confirm rather than question. In plain English, stressed people see what they expect to see. If a crew has studied Sheffield all day, flies across the North Sea, dodges defenses, fights weather, and arrives at the right time, then sees a Sheffield-sized glow in roughly the right place, the human mind wants that to be true. And then something dangerous happens. One confirmation triggers another. The navigator calls it. The bombardier agrees. The pilot trusts them both. And once the crew starts the run, the mission shifts from, "Is this the target?" to deliver the bombs and survive. British decoys were designed to trigger that chain reaction, not with perfect replicas, but with plausible signals that pushed crews into commitment. And there were three specific pressures the decoys exploited. First, hierarchy in the aircraft. German bomber crews operated with clear roles. The navigator's call carried weight. The bombardier's job was to hit the target the navigator identified, not reopen the navigation debate in the last seconds. Under fire, junior voices don't tend to overrule senior calls. That structure makes teams efficient, but it also creates a blind spot. If the navigator commits to the decoy, the whole crew often follows. Second, the "we've come this far" pressure. Night raids were dangerous. Fuel was limited. Defenses were real. Turning back without bombing meant failure. Circling to double-check meant more time in danger. So when crews saw a plausible target, many did what humans do under stress. They grabbed the chance to finish the job and get out. Third, false consensus. This one is nasty. If multiple crews bomb the same decoy on different nights, their reports reinforce each other. Intelligence officers back home see repeated claims of heavy damage in the same area and conclude the target must be getting smashed. Except the consistency isn't proof of accuracy. It's proof the deception is consistently working. Over time, those reports could create a gap between German belief and British reality. Cities reported destroyed that kept producing aircraft, engines, and ammunition. And that gap wasn't a small accounting error. It distorted strategy. If you believe you've crippled a city's industry, you shift resources elsewhere. You chase new targets. You declare success too early. That's how a decoy doesn't just save buildings. It can redirect an entire bombing campaign. The human side. Someone had to run the illusion. It's easy to talk about decoys like they were machines. They weren't. They were run by people. people who understood that doing their job well meant attracting bombs. Decoy crews came from different corners of Britain's home defense world: Royal Engineers, local defense volunteers, and women serving in supporting Air Force roles who handled communications and electrical systems. It wasn't glamorous duty. It wasn't a poster image job. It was long nights, hard weather, mud, smoke, and the constant knowledge that success increased danger. There wasn't a comfortable training pipeline for this. A lot of learning was blunt and immediate. You follow procedures, you trust timing, and when the attack comes close, you discover fast what works and what doesn't. Think about how backward the job is compared to normal survival instincts. Most people in wartime try to disappear. Blackouts, shelters, silence. Decoy crews did the opposite. They lit up. They built targets. They made their positions attractive. And on the worst nights, they had to keep the illusion alive even after the first explosions hit nearby, because a decoy that goes dark mid-raid stops being believable. The work cycle could be punishing. Arrive before nightfall, check systems, load fuel points, confirm communication lines, then wait, sometimes for hours, until observers reported enemy aircraft and the first markers dropped. Then the switch flips from waiting to performance. Ignition sequence, timed expansions, adjustments based on wind, moving between positions, watching for the moment a bomber stream commits. And once the bombs start falling, you're trying to do two things at the same time: keep the pattern convincing and keep your people alive. Even when the raid ended, the night wasn't over. The decoy couldn't keep burning into the morning. Daylight reconnaissance could reveal too much, so crews often had to put out the fires they started, deal with damage, repair lines, and reset for the next night. This wasn't a one-time trick. The whole power of the system came from repetition, night after night, season after season, year after year, when doubt started creeping in. As the war rolled on, the Luftwaffe didn't instantly solve the problem, but doubt began to spread. If you're told you smashed a target, but production keeps showing up in enemy hands, if you're told you wrecked a port, but ships keep getting repaired, eventually someone notices the math feels off. German leadership pushed for more reconnaissance, more verification, more rules about what counted as destroyed, but that had its own cost. More checking meant slower operations, more circling, more fuel use, more aborts, more risk. Even partial awareness of deception could still help Britain, because the moment you suspect decoys exist, certainty collapses, and bombing without certainty is less effective even before you count what actually hits the ground. So by the time the decoy program was mature, it wasn't only stealing bombs, it was stealing confidence. In Part 3, we'll finally put hard numbers on what this deception achieved, how many sorties were likely diverted, how much tonnage landed on empty ground, what that meant for casualties and industrial output, and why this huge British operation barely shows up in mainstream WWI storytelling even today. So by now, you've got the how. Britain built decoys that looked right, felt right, and showed up at the exact moment German crews expected a real city to appear. They exploited stress, hierarchy, and the urge to finish a dangerous mission fast. But here's the real question: did it actually change the war in a measurable way? Because if this was just a clever sideshow, it wouldn't matter. But if it pulled serious bomb tonnage away from real streets, real factories, and real families, then it's one of the biggest hidden wins of the entire home front fight. And the best way to answer that is with the cold, unglamorous stuff: numbers. The diversion problem: how many bombs went to nowhere? Over the course of the Blitz and the years after, Germany flew tens of thousands of bombing sorties against Britain. Not all of those missions were aimed at cities, and not all of them even found their target area in bad weather. But when British analysts studied patterns and compared raid reports with actual damage, a consistent conclusion emerged: a significant slice of German attacks didn't land where Germany intended. Estimates vary by period and target, but Britain's decoy network appears to have pulled a very large number of bomb loads onto empty ground, often on the order of roughly a quarter of attempted attacks, sometimes higher in specific areas where decoys were especially well placed. Think about what that means in plain terms. If you're running a strategic bombing campaign, and 1 out of every 3 or 4 sorties drops on farmland instead of a factory district, that's not a minor mistake. That's a massive drain on resources, fuel, aircraft wear, trained crews, and bombs that can't be used twice. Now look at tonnage. When you add it up, you're not talking about a handful of stray bombs. You're talking about tens of thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiaries landing in places designed to absorb them with minimal human cost. For perspective, London's Blitz damage came from a much smaller number than most people imagine when they picture the whole city flattened. Even a single major urban campaign can be measured in tons. So if decoys absorbed multiples of that tonnage over time, the scale is hard to ignore. This is why decoy operations weren't cute. They were economically brutal to the attacker. Germany paid full price for every mission. Britain made a large percentage of those missions pay out in empty fields. Why this saved more than buildings? It's tempting to treat this as a property protection story, like Britain just saved bricks and steel. But in a bombing war, diversion equals lives. If you pull bombs away from crowded blocks, you reduce deaths, injuries, and long-term harm. And if you pull bombs away from rail hubs, ports, factories, and power infrastructure, you keep the country functioning. You keep production moving. You keep the war effort from choking. When analysts later tried to estimate what decoys likely prevented, the most commonly cited result is straightforward. Casualty totals would have been significantly higher without them. No one can compute an exact lives saved number down to the last digit because war doesn't run like a spreadsheet. Weather changes raids, bomber streams drift, some bombs miss no matter what. But across years of operations, it is entirely reasonable to say the decoy system prevented many thousands of additional civilian deaths and injuries by shifting bombs away from where people actually slept and worked. And that many thousands matters because the Blitz was already horrific. Britain didn't need to eliminate bombing to win. It needed to survive it without collapsing. Decoys helped to do that. Case study logic. The perception gap. Here's a second way to see effectiveness. Look at the gap between what German crews reported and what British damage teams found. For certain targets, especially major industrial cities, German after-action reports often described heavy destruction, but Britain's actual industrial output and on-the-ground assessments didn't match the claimed levels of damage. That mismatch wasn't random. It followed a pattern that lines up with decoy placement and decoy operations. In other words, the enemy believed he had crippled a target, and that belief shaped strategy. If you're a commander and you think you've hammered an industrial city into the ground, you don't keep spending aircraft and crews on it. You shift to fresh targets. You go after new ports, new factories, new cities. That means the decoy doesn't just absorb bombs. It can also redirect the enemy's priorities. And that's a strategic multiplier. Fewer bombs today, plus fewer missions tomorrow. Take a city like Birmingham, for example. It mattered because it built and assembled war material, engines, parts, machinery, and other industrial output that fed Britain's ability to keep fighting. If German leadership believed Birmingham was far more damaged than it really was, the Luftwaffe could check the box and move on while Birmingham continued to function. That's not just survival, that's war production continuity. Now think about ports and dockyards. Ports aren't only about ships at sea. They're about repairs, supply flow, and everything moving in and out of the country. A sustained bombing campaign against a major dockyard could choke logistics, slow convoy protection, and weaken the Royal Navy's ability to repair battle damage quickly. If decoys pulled a big portion of attacks away from those docks, they weren't just protecting buildings. They were protecting Britain's ability to keep ships operational. In a long war, that's enormous. The enemy starts to feel the weirdness. Decoys also had an effect you can't measure only with crater counts: confidence. German bomber crews weren't dumb. They talked. They compared notes. They saw that targets destroyed, on paper, kept producing. They saw that damage claims didn't always match later reconnaissance or observed results. And once that doubt takes root, behavior changes. Crews circle longer. They hesitate. They spend more fuel trying to verify. Some abort more often in bad conditions. Commanders demand more confirmation. Recon flights increase. Procedures get more strict. All of those reactions cost time, fuel, and tempo. So even when decoys were partially suspected, they could still help Britain because they introduced friction into German operations. And friction is deadly in war. The moment you're not sure if the city under you is real, your whole mission becomes less efficient. You can't just show up, release, and leave. You waste minutes. You waste fuel. You increase exposure to defenses and accidents. Britain didn't need every German crew to fall for the trick every time. It just needed enough uncertainty to bleed the attacker's momentum. The price Britain paid. This wasn't free. Britain invested serious money, manpower, and planning into the decoy program. Materials were scarce in wartime. Skilled labor mattered. Thousands of personnel were involved in building, maintaining, and operating sites over multiple years. And then there's the human risk. Decoy crews weren't safe, and they knew it. Their job was, by design, to attract bombs. Official casualty records show that operators were killed and wounded in these roles, not at the scale of frontline infantry battles, but enough to make the danger undeniable. Every death in that program meant the deception worked, because it meant bombs came to the decoy site instead of a packed neighborhood. That's a hard truth. The cost-benefit math, though, points in the same direction over and over. The program was worth it, not because it was cheap, but because the alternative was far worse. More dead civilians, more wrecked infrastructure, more production lost, more pressure on Britain's ability to keep fighting. This was a place where a relatively small number of volunteers accepted high risk so that far larger numbers of civilians didn't take the hit. And that's why the story deserves attention. It's courage. Just not the movie kind. When the Germans finally put the puzzle together, Germany didn't fully understand the decoy network in real time the way we can now with archives laid open. But by the later war years, German intelligence did start to suspect they were being manipulated. They pushed for more verification, more reconnaissance, and stricter standards for confirming destruction. That reaction is evidence on its own, because once an attacker starts spending extra resources just to verify reality, the defender is already winning a portion of the fight. And here's the punch. Even when you discover a deception exists, you don't instantly undo its damage. If you spent years planning based on false destruction reports, if you shifted targets, reallocated effort, made strategic assumptions, that distortion doesn't vanish. It continues to ripple through decisions. Deception isn't only about the bomb that hits a field, it's about the decision made next week because someone believes that bomb hit the factory. So, why don't people know this story? Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Britain's decoy program was large, sustained, and effective. Yet most people, especially in the United States, barely hear about it. Meanwhile, other deception stories get a lot more spotlight. American deception efforts in World War II are often covered, and rightly so. Some were brilliant, but Britain's decoy network had a scale and duration that should make it a staple of popular WW2 storytelling. So why isn't it? Part of it is simple: secrecy. After the war, Britain didn't immediately broadcast every detail of its deception infrastructure. Some information stayed classified for years. Sites were dismantled, equipment removed. A lot of operators went home and didn't talk much, partly because they were told not to, partly because the experience was hard to explain. Another part is that this kind of story is tough to shoot in a clean, heroic way. There's no clear duel, no dogfight, no single dramatic showdown. It's long nights, waiting, lighting patterns, taking cover, repairing damage, and doing it again. It's a war story built on patience and psychology. That doesn't fit the classic Hollywood blueprint. And then there's narrative gravity. American audiences naturally see World War II through American units and American battle moments. That doesn't mean anyone is hiding British contributions on purpose. It's just how national storytelling works. What feels close gets told more often, and what feels distant becomes background. The result is the same, though. A major British operation slips into the margins. The proof that still lingers. Here's something eerie. Long after the war, some former decoy sites left physical marks on the land. Burn scars, altered soil, traces of where fires were repeatedly lit. Not always visible, not everywhere, but enough that researchers and local historians have sometimes found evidence that outlasted public memory. In a way, that's the perfect summary of this whole story. The ground remembered, the culture forgot, but the historical record is clear on the big idea. Britain created fake targets, sometimes huge, sometimes simple, to bend German bombing away from where it would hurt most. And it did it not once, but as a disciplined system, refined over years. The strategic lesson: If you strip away the WW2 uniforms and the black and white photos, the lesson is surprisingly modern. Technology changes fast. Human perception doesn't. Under stress, people look for confirmation. Organizations rely on hierarchy and specialization. Crews want to complete the mission and get home alive. Analysts trust repeated reports, especially when they line up with expectations. Britain took those predictable human behaviors and turned them into a weapon. Not by magic, by building a believable alternate reality at the exact moment enemy crews needed something to believe. The real ending of the story. So circle back to that bomber crew early in the war, staring down at flames and thinking, we got it. They weren't bombing a city. They were bombing a story Britain wrote for them. And while those crews reported success, British factories kept running, British ports kept repairing ships, British rail lines kept moving supplies, and thousands of civilians who might have been under those bombs weren't. That doesn't mean Britain was safe. It doesn't mean the Blitz wasn't devastating. It means Britain found a way to shave down the damage, quietly, systematically, by making the enemy waste his strength. Britain built fake cities to fool German bombers. And it worked because the lie was designed to fit the enemy's mind. Not flashy, not famous, but effective enough that it helped keep a nation alive.